I'd like to welcome back for a second time to Truth Seekers Northeast, Mr. Mark Devlin. And this talk's going to be self-explanatory, so I'm just going to hand it over to this man here. So, take it away.
All right, well, thanks very much. Sorry again for the delay, folks. I'll try and make it worth it. No pressure, eh? And thanks to everyone for turning out today. I think probably a few of you were at my last talk, which was about the manipulations of the corporate music industry generally, and all the different methods and tactics that are used to mind control us through entertainment. The talk today is specifically about the Beatles, and the second part is all about Paul McCartney and that conspiracy. One thing about me as a researcher is that I don't discriminate. I'm very inclusive, I'm very progressive in keeping with the spirit of the times, you know, so I seek to piss everyone off, and I seek to denigrate everyone's heroes. So I am dealing with the Beatles today, but if your favourite group is somebody else, don't worry, I'll get to them another time. There's always something to say about these groups. But joking aside though, I would love to be able to stand up here today and tell you that the official story of the Beatles is exactly as we've been told by mainstream media all these years, which is it's four regular working class lads from Liverpool that worked really hard, wrote a few good songs, played some gigs, hustled, made a few connections, did a bit of networking, worked really hard, crossed their fingers for good luck, and it all came together. And they just happened to become the most successful and influential band of all time, still being talked about 50 odd years later. Unfortunately, all the research bears out that that is not the case. And these really are, this really is a fascinating group to delve into in terms of looking for unsettling, dark, nefarious aspects to them. It doesn't disappoint, and there's no shortage of them. And when you get into this research, you come to realise that the group weren't anything but these four working class lads that just happened to make it against all the odds. We see elements of establishment manipulation. We see elements of military intelligence services being involved. We see secret society, mystery school fraternities, particularly Freemasonry. We see the presence of state-sponsored mind control experimentation going on, and we see social engineering, plus dark occult symbolism from start to finish. So I'm going to be giving you some examples of that in the first section today. And a good place to start, I feel, would be in the naming of the very group itself. Why is that off the screen? That's a very good question, isn't it? It looks as if all the slides are over to one side for some reason. Which didn't happen last time I did this on Tuesday. Let me just try and fix that. This will look good on the film, won't it?
I'll edit that bit more.
Yeah, please do. Why is it doing this? That looks a bit better. Okay. So the very naming of the group itself gives us our first clues as to some occult, metaphysical stuff going on. So John Lennon first named the group the Blackjacks before it was morphed into the Quarrymen, and then it became Johnny and the Moondogs, the Nurk Twins for just 2 days, the Beatles spelt with 2 A's, then the Silver Beatles, the Silver Beats, and then the Silver Beatles, before eventually dropping the silver and surviving as the Beatles. So it becomes an interesting name to study. In terms of why Lennon settled on that final name, this is an infamous interview that he gave in 1961 for Mersey Beat magazine when he was asked about the name of the group. And he said famously, "We will tell you, it came in a vision. A man appeared on a flaming pie and said unto them, from this day on, you are Beatles with an A. Thank you, Mr. Man," they said, thanking him. That strikes me as an element of masterful speaking going on there. The truth is being veiled and occulted in the language that Lennon is choosing to use, and it doesn't really tell us a whole lot. When we get into the teachings of the notorious occultist Aleister Crowley, however, whose name crops up in this story time and time again, we have this book that he put out many decades ago called the Winged Beetle. And you'll note that in the title of this, we have the names of two groups that Paul McCartney has been involved with, the Beatles and latterly Wings. So the Winged Beetle was part of the thelemic teachings of Crowley, and the Beatles would appear to have had a reverence for the works of Crowley, as did many prominent rock music acts. This is a dung beetle, which is very much revered, believe it or not, by ancient Egyptian cultures. And they saw this creature and the fact that it rolled up its dung into a ball like this and rolled it across the ground as being symbolic of the sun being rolled across the sky during each day. And so the scarab beetle was very important and central to ancient Egyptian mythology. And we find references to Egyptian mythology in the body of work of the Beatles as we go through. So it wouldn't surprise me if the group was named in reference to this beetle, the scarab beetle, which was part of this solar worship system of ancient Egypt. There it is on a piece of architecture. Just as an interesting aside here, this is a coat of arms that was created for George Martin, the long-time Beatles producer, and very much an establishment piece of furniture when you get into his background. This isn't a family crest that has come through generations. It was done relatively recently, just a few decades ago, I think, in deference to George Martin. And you'll notice that in the centre of the shield there, you've got 3 of these scarab beetles. Not 4, but 3, which will become interesting as we move on to part 2. The childhood of John Lennon is very interesting to study. There's a video which I came across online just recently that was put up there by Thomas Sheridan, the Irish researcher, and he's looked into the area where the young John Lennon grew up, living with his Aunt Mimi in the Walton area of Liverpool. So first of all, the name of the street that he grew up in was Menlove Avenue, which is a name to conjure with in any circumstances. Just down the road you had the original Strawberry Field, which was a very gothic looking children's home, flanked by these gates at the front. And this was an area that Lennon, the childhood Lennon, would evidently hang out in, and obviously coloured the song, the famous Strawberry Fields Forever, which was released early 1967. This is the Strawberry Fields tribute in Central Park, New York, with the word Imagine in the middle, after his famous song, and with some interesting sort of symbolism going around the outside. So this is close to where Lennon was assassinated outside the Dakota Building in New York in 1980. So you've got the original Strawberry Fields in Liverpool, and then across the ocean there's the Strawberry Field tribute in Central Park. So here's a map of this area of Liverpool, Walton, with Menlove Avenue running through the centre there. When you look at some of the road names that are lying around, you've got the Calderstones Park just over here on the left. You've got a street known as the Hollies, as in Hollywood, which was used by the Druids in ancient civilizations as part of these magic wands that they would use for their ceremonies. That's how Hollywood in the United States got named. And also we've got a couple of road names up here, Druidsville Road, and what's the other one? The other one is Druids Crossroad here. Here are the road signs from this area. So the street names are all named after Druid, pagan, ritualistic activity. And the maker of this video, Thomas Sheridan, is speculating on the effect that this would have had on the young Lennon, and how this may well have coloured some of the later Beatles songs and some of the symbolism that came into their work. Either way, it's an interesting start for a young lad to have. He went on to become a prominent musician. So in the video he states, all this must have directly impacted upon the young Lennon as he played in the ancient Strawberry Fields, which had remained intact for centuries. The field would have retained the same mystical animism within its environment from pre-Christian times. And he adds, these childhood experiences would have been released from his subconscious as Lennon began to explore Hinduism and other spiritual paths during the writing and recording of Strawberry Fields Forever. Now this is John Lennon's old man, Freddie Lennon, who was a sailor, and he spent much of the young John's childhood away at sea. There's a character in the animated Beatles movie, which didn't actually feature the Beatles at all, but it was based around their music, Yellow Submarine, released in 1968. That is a cartoon that is absolutely loaded with occult symbolism. There's a character in there known as Old Fred, who is a sailor. So you've got to wonder whether it was modelled on Freddie Lennon, John's dad. So this guy was a bit of an amateur musician himself, and he put out a single called That's My Life. It's misspelt here as That's My Live, but the sleeve is very interesting because we've got the first rendering of the black and white duality that we see on the floor of Freemasonic temples, representing the duality that's inherent in nature, light and dark, up and down, good and evil, as above, so below. It's very much linked to mystery school teachings, particularly Freemasonry. Now I've got a snippet of the Freddie Lennon song here, which I just wanted to play you as a matter of interest, because to me he sounds uncannily like John. Their voices are very, very similar, and I just wanted to play this as a matter of curiosity. I don't think this is wired for sound, so we're going to have to rely on the output from my laptop speakers, so I hope you can hear it.
I'll pick up my story where I once stepped up. I sailed with the tides, I lived on dreams. I watched the sunrise over every ocean. That's my life, that's my love, and my home. It started in Liverpool, where I was born. No father to advise me, but I carried on. The first time I saw the sea, I just knew this had to be. That's my life, that's my love, and my home.
Right, so you get a free hearing test with today's talk. Sorry if that was a bit of a strain. But to me, that sounded uncannily like John, you know, very similar voices. So there would have been some kind of influence on the young John Lennon from his dad, clearly, even though he was absent for much of his youth, as I say. This is the first intact original lineup of the Beatles. So we got the four that we know, or sorry, the three that we know. There's John Lennon, Paul McCartney, or is it? That's for part two. George Harrison, and they're joined by, over on the right-hand side, the original bassist, Stuart Sutcliffe, who was in that role before Paul McCartney took over, and we'll get on to what happened to Stuart Sutcliffe in a moment. And then in the middle, you've got the original drummer, Pete Best, before he was replaced by Ringo. So this guy was in place up until August 1962. And he was kicked out of the band just before the Beatles made it big with their debut single Love Me Do in October of '62. The story that we get is that Pete was quite a good looking lad, and he used to attract the attention of female fans. And Paul and John weren't too keen at all the attention that Pete Best was getting from the ladies, so they kicked him out and replaced him with Ringo. Problem solved. Pete Best's mother, Mona Best, ran a venue in Liverpool called the Casbah Coffee Club, and like the Cavern, this was one of the venues where the Beatles played their very early gigs in Liverpool, during the same period that they were going over to Hamburg and doing these gruelling schedules of gigs over there. But there's another interesting story that comes from the Beatles camp connected to Pete Best's mother, Mona Best. There are two Beatles associates that were with them throughout their successful years. You had Mel Evans, we'll be covering him again as we move on. He was a kind of roadie and a general assistant, tried and trusted confidant to the Beatles. And another guy was Neil Aspinall, who later became one of the principal operatives in Apple Music, the Apple record label. But Neil Aspinall was with them from the start. He was also a roadie and a general assistant to the Beatles. Well, Neil Aspinall moved in with Pete Best's family for a period in Liverpool back in the day, and during this time he impregnated Pete Best's mother, and the result was a son known as Rogue Best. So you had this interesting situation where you've got Neil Aspinall, who's the same age as all these lads, and he's now got a son by Pete Best's mother, which is a very tricky situation. So whether that had any bearing on Pete being kicked out of the band to avoid that kind of awkwardness, I don't know. But either way, we ended up with a four-piece band. And the way that occurred was through the exit of Stuart Sutcliffe. at the ripe old age of 21. He died of a brain aneurysm. The story that we get about that is that the Beatles were gigging in Hamburg, and that was a pretty edgy, dangerous location in those times, and often at the gigs that they would play, they would descend into violent chaos. And on this one particular occasion, we hear that the Beatles got involved in a fight with some locals, and Stuart Sutcliffe went to the aid of John Lennon, who was getting beaten up, and he took a kick in the head. And we're told that that's what led to this brain aneurysm that went on to kill him at the age of 21. There's an interesting variation on that story told by Stuart Sutcliffe's sister, Pauline. She put out a book, an autobiography, a few years ago, and she suggests in that book that Stuart Sutcliffe and John Lennon went through a period where they were homosexual lovers. And she suggests that the fight in which Stuart sustained that injury which killed him was connected to that and not so much to the fight that occurred at this gig. So that's coming from Stu Sutcliffe's sister. Either way, the Sutcliffe family came out of Scotland, home of 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemasonry, right? And here we've got Stuart given an interesting hand sign right down above his sacrum. He's making this triangle of manifestation, which figures in Freemasonry and other occult mystery schools. The idea being that you can bring into physical manifestation anything that you apply your will or your intent to. Now, this picture was taken before the Beatles became famous. This would have been probably around 1961. So it can't have been the case that the group had already been signed up by the industry and they'd already sold their souls and, you know, had basically given themselves over to the Illuminati forces that control the music industry. This was prior to that, and it does suggest that at least this member of the group came out of a Freemasonic family, which might give some indication as to what the Beatles were really all about. I can't find any other direct family links with the other Beatles to Freemasonic families, but it doesn't mean they're not there. Here's another interesting picture of Stuart Sutcliffe from the same sort of period. He's standing behind this gate, and you'll see that you've got these swirls in the arrangement of the iron gate there, and they're forming 3 sixes. So it's 666, this number that's so beloved of the forces that control the entertainment industries. That picture would not have been taken by accident, it would have been posed, and there's a message that's being communicated there subliminally. We see so many of these. There's a very strong suggestion among many researchers that the Beatles were either a creation of, or were attached to in some way, the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations coming out of London. This think tank organisation that's concerned with social engineering, perception management, and sowing certain ideas and belief systems in the mind of the general public. That's what they specialise in. It's what they've been doing since the 1920s. The main claim to this end comes from this guy, Dr. John Coleman, who is a former military intelligence guy. I think he worked with MI5. And he came out as something of a whistleblower, put out a book in 1991 entitled Conspirators' Hierarchy, The Story of the Committee of 300. And in the pages of this book, he claims that the Beatles were a direct creation of the Tavistock Institute. Their role was to subvert morality and culture and break up the traditional family unit in line with many other societal changes which happened during the 1960s. And he states that this guy, Theodor Adorno, who was connected to the Frankfurt School in Germany, which is very much an equivalent of the Tavistock Institute, again concerned with social engineering, was responsible for writing many of the Beatles' lyrics. So he claims that songs that were credited to Lennon and McCartney were actually written by Theo Adorno. Now, all we have to go by in this book is Coleman's assertions, Coleman's word for it. He doesn't offer any documentary evidence or citations to back up these claims, which is unfortunate. But he does go into some detail about how he feels Adorno was involved in the shaping of the Beatles' sound through their songs. So this is a quote from the book where he says, Theodor Adorno was well known to Tavistock. He was known as the Karl Marx of music. He called his sound corrosive and unacceptable, and it was based on a 12 atonal system consisting of heavy, repetitive sounds. He started writing all his songs using this system. Adorno believed the bourgeoisie wanted music that didn't bother them or make them think. Tavistock wanted to pass on these new musical experiences to new audiences, affecting the masses, so uncomfortable music was born. You can probably tell Coleman was not a fan of popular music. So we can make what we will of these claims. I personally don't buy that Theodore Adorno would have been responsible for writing all these Beatles songs. However, I do question whether all these famous songs came out of the Lennon and McCartney stable, given that there were just so many songs released during the 1960s credited to this pair. It works out at something like they would have had to have written songs at a rate of 40 to 45 every year between 1962 and 1970 for all those songs to really have come from them. And one of the things that makes me question it is the maturity and sense of life experience that's present in many Lennon and McCartney songs. You've got to remember these were very young guys when they first broke through. When the Beatles first achieved prominence in 1962, George Harrison was still only 19 years of age. Paul McCartney is said to have written Yesterday when he was barely 23. We're going to get on to that. And many of their famous songs just smack of a kind of life experience that young lads in their early 20s just would probably not have gained, in my opinion. So it leaves us questioning where many of these songs may have come from. It may well be that many were contributed by George Martin and also the Asher family, and we're going to get onto them as well. So this is an extract from my book, Musical Truth Volume 1, and I'm referencing this blog site, No One Has to Die Tomorrow. So the quote is, "The Beatles' ascension to the top rung of the rock and roll pantheon, displacing Elvis Presley and American rock legends, was rigged and engineered into place by the British Crown and British military intelligence." This is according to this blog writer. For instance, in August '63, at their first major TV appearance, the newspaper reported that police had to hold back 1,000 squealing teenagers, but the story was fabricated. The newspaper photo actually tightly cropped 3 screaming teenagers and claimed it was 1,000. Similarly, Beatlemania hysteria was manufactured at JFK Airport in February '64 when the Beatles arrived in the USA to perform for the Ed Sullivan Show for the first time. Busloads of girls from a Bronx school were paid by Beatles promoters to scream hysterically when the Beatles got off the plane and went into the terminal. So that second story has been confirmed. You know, it's on the record that these girls were paid a sum to scream hysterically to create this image for the Beatles. So it was obviously in the interests of certain parties for this group to become majorly influential. It was always on the cards that they would become as successful as they did and become the prominent band of that period. They were selected for the role over and above any other contenders. When we get into the imagery of some early Beatles record sleeves, we find lots of telling clues and indicators. Again, none of this stuff creeps in there by accident. It's all designed to communicate something subconsciously to the general public. It's there on an exoteric basis and an esoteric basis. So there's the version of the record sleeve that's designed to be absorbed by the profane masses as they see it, you know, the general population that never look into anything that lies beneath the surface. They just take everything that they're presented with at face value. And then there's the esoteric level where people look underneath the surface and try to understand what's being communicated symbolically. And we can do that with some of these sleeves. So this is With the Beatles, one of their early albums that came out in '63. And you've got the 4 group members with their faces shaded. Half of their faces are cut off. So it's accentuating the one eye that we see so often, the one eye symbolism. But it also could be indicating the shadow self of these individuals within occult mystery school belief systems. This one is interesting, the Beatles '65. We've got the 4 group members sitting underneath umbrellas. Why would that particular setting and pose have been chosen by the photographer, I wonder? Well, the word umbrella is derived from the Latin umbra, and this definition of it states that it's from the late 16th century, denoting a phantom or a ghost, from the Latin meaning literally shade. there was a song by Rihanna, which you might remember, that came out in 2007, big #1 hit called Umbrella. And I did an interview at the time with a guy called Lennon Honor, who's a brilliant researcher from the US. And he was talking about the symbolism in the video to Rihanna's Umbrella. So on the surface, again, this is the cover story that the general public, the profane masses, are given to explain what the song is all about. It's supposed to be about this person offering their protection to their lover. You can stand under my umbrella, I'll keep you safe from harm, you know? But Lennon pointed out that there's an alternative narrative running here, which is when you look at the meaning of the word umbra, and it's denoting a phantom or a ghost or a spirit, what she's actually singing about in the song, and this is matched by the graphics in the video, she's talking about being under the possession or the influence of a non-human entity. And that's what the meaning of standing under the umbrella is really all about. So it's interesting that that's the meaning that's been attributed to that song and video all these decades later. And back in the 1960s, we had the Beatles sitting underneath umbrellas. I think there's definitely something being communicated in that picture, beyond it being just a cute way for them to pose for the cover. This is from the album Help, released in 1965. On the surface, the Beatles appear to be spelling out the word help in semaphore, right? You would just assume that's H-E-L-P. But when you attribute those signs to semaphore, it doesn't come out as anywhere close to help. It's just nonsense and gibberish. But they do very closely resemble these grade signs coming from the AA. Nothing to do with cars or alcoholism. This is Argentum Astrum, the AA, which was one of the secret societies that was fronted for a time by Aleister Crowley. He founded it. So within that, you had the initiates, the adepts, that would be taught these grade signs to express certain statements. And the Beatles appear to be spelling out grade signs from the AA here. So we've got another link going into Aleister Crowley with that particular record sleeve. And here's a rare Dutch version of it, where the group are doing the same signs in front of what appears to be a giant corporate logo of the Shell Oil Corporation, right? Well, in fact, that's never been a shell. The meaning of that logo has always been as denoting the rising sun. It's the rays of the rising sun. It's connected to solar worship. So again, we have another sort of very symbolic and esoteric Beatles album sleeve there. For those who know, for those who can read between the lines and understand this. The claim that the Beatles were a product of the Tavistock Institute and they were being used for social engineering purposes during those all-important days of the 1960s also applies to the Rolling Stones, and many researchers will say that the Beatles and the Stones were set up as a kind of dialectic, so that young music fans were invited to choose between one group or the other. So the Beatles, when they first started out, were this clean-cut, fairly respectable group that your granny would like, your auntie would like. They were family-friendly. Whereas the Rolling Stones from day one were always marketed as more edgy, more dangerous, more rough and ready. So if the Beatles were a bit too soft for you, you know, you had the Rolling Stones that were more to your tastes. But this smacks of a classic dialectic where people are just given two choices. And we've seen this one played out in the music industry through the decades as well. I'm old enough to remember in the early 1980s, all the girls at my school were either into Duran Duran or Spandau Ballet. It was one or the other. Those are the two groups that were pitted against each other. And then in the 90s, we had the same dynamic played out in the Britpop manufactured stunt, where you had Oasis pitched against Blur, and people were coming down on one of those sides. So it seems the Beatles and the Stones were an early play-out of this. And although they were marketed as rivals, they were in fact really good friends. They used to hang out together, they used to go and do drugs together at each other's houses. And in the sleeve to this Rolling Stones album, which was released in December 1967, first of all, the sleeve design is a very direct homage to the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper sleeve, which had been released 6 months earlier. This album is called Their Satanic Majesty's Request. What's in a name, right? And hidden cleverly in the artwork to this album, in the same way that all kinds of clues were hidden in the Sgt. Pepper sleeve, are the faces of the four Beatles. Paul, George, John, Ringo. It's indicating there where they appear in the sleeve. So the Rolling Stones and the Beatles pretty much came as a package. There was even this guy, Andrew Loog Oldham, who worked with both groups. He was once a manager in the early days for the Beatles before jumping ship and going over to the Rolling Stones and working as a publicist for that group. And there's military family connections going on there as well, not for the first or last time. Then we have the Beatles being affiliated with Jimmy Savile. And people will say, well, anyone who was anyone in the pop music business in the 60s kind of had to get on with Savile because he was the prominent disc jockey of those times, and if you wanted him to play your record, you had to kind of associate with him. But the Beatles did have quite a strong association with Savile. He introduced them at many of their early gigs and went out on the road and travelled with them from place to place. We've got this interesting picture here where Savile's posing in this black and white checkered coat, which is again indicative of the duality that we saw in the Masonic checkerboard design earlier, and it's also been identified as a mind control trigger for mind control victims when this pattern is seen. There's another guy in the picture there in the middle. I think that might be Tony Prince of Radio Luxembourg, but I'm not entirely sure who it is. And here's another picture of Savile with the Beatles, and they're all acting like they're in a coma or in a trance, which may or may not be quite telling. Here's a picture of the group, and we have John and Paul at the back there indicating the hidden hand. They're doing a hidden hand sign, which is hinting at secret society influence and the sequestering of knowledge away from the profane masses, just to the chosen few that are part of these fraternities. And it's not the only picture that we've seen this happening in. Many world leaders and dignitaries and royals and aristocrats through the ages have been pictured with the hidden hand sign, putting the hand inside their jacket, tellingly. Here's a picture taken out in some fields, and you've got McCartney doing the same sign. So we've seen many different renderings of this. Something's being communicated there. When it comes to evidence for British military intelligence establishment infiltration into the Beatles, then we come to George Martin, the aforementioned. Known as the fifth Beatle, he was the producer that was very influential in shaping the Beatles' sound, particularly in their latter period. From the Sgt. Pepper album onwards, many of the experimental, pushing the envelope elements of Beatles' sound were achieved at the hands of George Martin. So he served in the Royal Air Force. We have another military connection there. There are many others. And before he got hooked up with the Beatles, he worked for a time for the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. An aspect of the BBC, of course, which is a state propaganda arm of the British government. And the Radiophonic Workshop was concerned with breaking new barriers in sound and seeing what could be achieved through sound frequency and sound production methods. He put out a record in 1962, coming out of the Radiophonic Workshop, under the pseudonym of Ray Cathode. And I've got a little snippet of the song next, which I want to play you, because to my ears this sounds very similar to the Beatles sound that would come a few years later. I think when you listen to this from 1962, you can hear some of the elements that George Martin went on to incorporate into certain Beatles recordings. So again, it might be a bit of a strain, but we'll see how we go with this, and I'll play you a snippet of this Ray Cathode tune. It was early days. There was a lot of shaping and moulding of the sound to come.
Quite catchy.
Yeah, some catchy shit, yeah. So the Radiophonic Workshop was the unit that devised the theme tune to Doctor Who, that very eerie, otherworldly sort of sound effect that we got. And that was typical of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop output. It was, you know, breaking new barriers with sound. And I think that's what the Beatles were certainly being used for in their latter period, from Sgt. Pepper onwards. So this is another extract from my book, Music of Truth Volume 1, where I stated, the dark manipulations of the music business are as old as the industry itself, and early examples of the dubious calling cards evident in the contemporary scene are equally present in its formative years. Mind control, military intelligence, because military intelligence is an oxymoron after all, paedophilia and occult fascination are nothing new. Then I'm talking about a writer who I quote, speculates on there being an organised link between the British music scene of the mid to late 60s and that which emerged out of LA's Laurel Canyon district in the same time frame. We're into the work of Dave McGowan here, who put out the book Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, documenting the Laurel Canyon music scene in Los Angeles of the mid to late 1960s and all the incredible links that we get going back into military intelligence and aspects of the United States establishment through the families of these prominent musicians. The suggestion of many researchers is that, like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones were a creation of some arm of the British government, intelligence services, as I mentioned previously, possibly the Tavistock Institute, and that, like their northern counterparts, they also constituted a massive exercise in shaping the social attitudes of a generation. Mind-altering drugs were never far from the picture. So that's really just recapping on what I mentioned a few minutes ago. But I really do feel that things that were going on in the United States with the whole hippie counterculture flower power scene, very much fueled by huge quantities of LSD that were being put into the market by the CIA, that's no longer any kind of conspiracy theory. There's all kinds of documentary evidence, including confessions by people that worked in the CIA, that the intelligence agencies were putting all these drugs out there into the market during this psychedelic era. That was happening in the San Francisco area, particularly Haight-Ashbury of California, but we had the whole Laurel Canyon scene coming out of LA as well, where many of these prominent musicians would congregate and from which we got all these sounds. But over in the UK, you had the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and other groups, the Animals possibly, from around this neck of the woods, that were also a part of a similar process, shaping and moulding and changing societal attitudes in line with far-reaching social engineering plans. And when you see the same changes in culture happening in the United Kingdom at exactly the same time as they're happening in the United States, it smacks of it being a coordinated plan and of complicity between the intelligence services in the UK and the US working together to make these things happen. So unfortunately, we're all entrained to think of the intelligence services, MI5, MI6, as being out to protect us, out to keep us safe, and to have our interests at heart. That's why we get the James Bond films, with this noble hero that risks his very life to protect his queen and country, right? But unfortunately, in this satanically inverted society in which we live, where lies and deception are everywhere, and where, if you want to get to the truth of a matter, you usually have to turn it 180 degrees on its head, and then you're getting somewhere close to the truth, the intelligence services are actually out to do us harm. And they exist to, not with our best interest at heart, shall we say. So their fingerprints are all over the manipulations of the 1960s, and of course the Beatles were very much caught up in that whole thing. There are a few tenuous links between the Beatles and that whole Laurel Canyon scene. I mean, when it comes to the Manson murders, the Tate LaBianca event, which happened in August of 1969, which is coming up to the 50th anniversary of that, there's all kinds of weird synchronicities that weave themselves into that story. So Charlie Manson stated that he foresaw this impending race war coming between blacks and whites, and he dubbed it Helter Skelter, saying that he was inspired by the Beatles track of that name, written by McCartney, which appeared on the Beatles' 1968 White Album. So there's the first connection between the Beatles and Manson, who was caught up in that whole Laurel Canyon scene. He was a musician himself. He was closely linked to Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. Then we have the fact that Sharon Tate, who was one of the victims of the Manson murders, was married to Roman Polanski. Roman Polanski directed the movie Rosemary's Baby. Rosemary's Baby was filmed and set in the Dakota Building in New York. It was called the Bramford in the movie, but it was clearly the Dakota Building, outside which John Lennon was assassinated in 1980. Then you have Rosemary's Baby, the movie, featuring Mia Farrow, the actress, one-time wife of Woody Allen, and she was present on the famous trip that the Beatles made in early 1968 to India to study under the Maharishi and to get into transcendental meditation and all this stuff. And her sister was also present. Her sister's name was Prudence, and the story is that she would stay in her bungalow the whole time and not come out and join the others in meditative practices. And so the Beatles penned the song Dear Prudence, Won't You Come Out to Play? That's the inspiration for that song, which appeared on the White Album. There's all kinds of other synchronicities as well, many of which I've probably forgotten. But I did find out just a couple of days ago that there's a new movie due to come out called Echo in the Canyon. And this is clearly going to be a whitewash piece. In my opinion, it's going to be damage limitation in light of the incredible impact that Dave McGowan's work has had in highlighting what the Laurel Canyon area was all about, and the fact that that entire scene was the creation of military intelligence. So in this Echo in the Canyon movie, we apparently get a few musicians that were there at the time. I think Graham Nash and Stephen Stills are going to be interviewed. There's Roger McGuinn of the Byrds and a few others. And Ringo Starr is apparently interviewed in this movie. I don't know why, because the Beatles were never officially a part of that Laurel Canyon scene. But he's going to be, you know, giving his recollections on what that whole scene was all about. So that's something to look out for in the coming weeks. This guy here sat at the typewriter is Derek Taylor, who was the publicist for the Beatles in their early days, before he jumped ship and relocated to Los Angeles, where he became a publicist for the likes of John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, and he worked with the Beach Boys and a few of the other groups coming out of that Laurel Canyon scene. So there's a loose, tenuous link there. Derek Taylor curated, or co-curated, the Monterey Pop Festival in June of '67, which is this very famous event that kicked off the whole Summer of Love, that LSD-drenched series of events. And Paul McCartney is said to have also helped curate that event. And when we get on to the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, in part 2, there's a reference in there to McCartney apparently confessing to being instrumental in getting all that LSD put into these music festivals to get all the kids turned on to it at the time. Anyway, here's Derek Taylor with George Harrison, and there's McGowan's book, just to remind us. There was a period where the Beatles stayed for a while in Laurel Canyon, or in that whole Hollywood Hills area of LA, and this inspired George Harrison to write the song Blue Jay Way, which appeared on the Magical Mystery Tour album in December '67. Apparently he was waiting in this house for Derek Taylor and the other Beatles to turn up, and they were taking forever, and so he decided to compose this song. Very psychedelic, very far out. It's one of the Beatles' weirdest songs, but it was inspired evidently by that whole area. And then we have John Lennon during his infamous Lost Weekend period, 1973-74, where apparently his marriage to Yoko Ono was failing, and to try and save it, she suggested that he should take himself off with their secretary, May Pang, which is who you can see Lennon kissing here, and go off and enjoy himself and just have a bit of a lad's time, you know. And this was his Lost Weekend period, where he hung out in LA, around the Sunset Strip area, with Harry Nilsson, who's the guy getting pissed at the front here. And so then we have another connection to this area of LA through the Beatles. It's slightly tenuous, but I think it could also be quite telling. We're back to Egyptian symbology and what appears to be a fascination with this among the Beatles. This is Paul McCartney's latest album, released just last year, called Egypt Station. And the cover here is replete with all kinds of signs and symbols that anyone who studies this stuff could have a field day with. Not the first time McCartney has dabbled with it. He put out an album in the early 70s called Ram. And a ram-headed god was one of the deities that was worshipped in ancient Egyptian culture. So it appears to be a throwback to that. McCartney also had a pseudonym in the 1970s of Percy Thrillington. And in 1977, he put out this orchestral instrumental album. And the individual on the cover appears with a ram's head, very similar to what we saw there. We have another connection into Egyptian mythology here with this entity, this creature, which is known as Heket. This is an extract from a blog called The Occult Beatles, which is run by a good friend of mine, Max Sergiu, who turned up at my talk in Birmingham on Tuesday, actually, and helped me out a bit. And he's doing this talk with me in Bristol, when I do that in July, to bring some of his own perspectives. But this is from his blog site, And he's researched this figure that appeared in Egyptian symbology known as Heket, connected to the Nile as is Khnum, who's been dubbed the king of the frogs. The frog was a lunar type. Now you might wonder what frogs have to do with the Beatles story. Well, if you cast your mind back to the 80s, I think one or two of us might be old enough to remember that, I know I am. 1984, Paul McCartney put out this song with the frog chorus called We All Stand Together. And at the time, people were saying, what the fuck is happening to McCartney? What's he doing? What's he thinking of? This is a strong argument in favour of Paul McCartney having been replaced. People say the real Paul would never have put out a song like this, you know. What was he thinking of? But what if there's more to it than was presented to us on the surface? And what if all along there's been hidden symbolic meaning to all of the Beatles' output? So in the inset there, we've got a depiction of this entity known as Heket from Egyptian mythology, and there's the frogs from the animated video that came with We All Stand Together. It could well be a harking back to that, I feel. More strange pictures that take some explaining. The Beatles appearing in an early publicity shot with Hannibal Lecter-style face masks on. So what's being hinted at here? Could this be the idea being conveyed of them not speaking secrets, not conveying secrets, not giving out information as to what they're really all about? The keeping of secrets is very much tied into these mystery schools, particularly Freemasonry. You see many artists putting this finger up to their lips to denote that the secret is going to be kept. They're not going to reveal the teachings to the profane ones. Here's Lennon with a flower over his eye, so we've got the one eye symbolism being conveyed again. 4 pictures of McCartney, which may or may not be the same one, but interesting that he's covering his eye with his finger in all these pictures, decades apart. Would this be something that was happening by accident or just instinctively, or is he conveying something there to those who have the eyes to see? Symbolism on the sleeve to the Yellow Submarine album from 1968. You've got McCartney giving what's known as the 666 sign within occult mystery circles, and Lennon with one rendering of this Baphomet horned hand sign. In another of these promotional pictures, he's got his palm to the camera, so he's turned it round the other way, and in this particular setting he's got the back of his hand to the camera. But these are symbols that we see cropping up time and time again in the music industry. Many artists have been pictured doing this over the decades, and it's all going back into Freemasonry and these other occult mystery schools. The presence of Yoko Ono takes some explaining away in the Beatles story. So she's not the most favourite of Beatles' wives among hardcore fans of the group, because many place the blame for the group breaking up on her shoulders, and they say that when she came into John's world, he was never the same again, he never had the same interest in the group, and she seemed to have this mind-controlling effect over him. Well, what if that was what her role was intended to be, as a mind-control handler to John Lennon? Her background in itself is very interesting. She came out of an aristocratic Japanese family where her mother was descended from the one-time emperor of Japan. So she's part of the Japanese establishment. Her father was part of a very prominent banking dynasty coming out of Japan. And he split his time between Japan and the United States. The family went over to live in the US for some time. Yoko is said to have been introduced to John Lennon on the 9th of November 1966. This is the infamous date, so that's 9/11/66. And the story goes that she was introduced at the Indica Gallery in London, to which the Beatles were very much tied. And it's said that she had this very controlling effect over Lennon from day one. He eventually took to calling her mother, according to witnesses. He would refer to her as mother. And she would pretty much dictate all his movements and just control everything that he got into from that point onward. And we definitely saw a personality shift in Lennon between the way he was during the Beatles' heyday of the 60s and the way he was during the 1970s. during the 60s, he was a real joker, a clown, a comedian, happy-go-lucky, always cracking gags. Evidently, according to reports, not a particularly pleasant person. He used to beat on his wife Cynthia, so the story goes, so the claims go. He was absent from his son Julian for many years. There's a video you can get online where he's mocking mentally disabled people. So you could make the case that he wasn't a particularly pleasant fella. But in the 1970s, we see him getting behind all this political activism, the anti-war movement, allying himself with the civil rights movements that were happening in the United States following their move to New York. And he comes out with all this amazing music that's spiritual and uplifting, like Instant Karma and Mind Games and Number 9 Dream and Watching the Wheels, these incredibly potent songs. So what's going on there? It's like two different people. Some will claim that he was replaced, like McCartney, but I don't get into that. I can only handle one Beatles replacement at a time. But definitely something happened to Lennon, and it would appear to be attributable to the influence of Yoko Ono. She would definitely appear to have been sent in. So here they are in witches' outfits. She actually put out an album, a remix album of songs a few years ago, titled Yes, I'm a Witch, just in case there was any doubt about it, you know. And there she is in her transhumanist sunglasses as well, to push that agenda. Now, another interesting thing about Yoko is that when her family moved over from Japan to base themselves in the United States, they ended up in a town called Scarsdale in Westchester County, New York State. Scarsdale is where the Eastman family, originally known as Epstein, so the father of that family was an immigrant, I think he was a Polish-Jewish immigrant by the name of Leopold Epstein. And he changed his name to Lee Eastman to sound less Jewish and more American. And of course he was the father of Linda Eastman, who became Linda McCartney. So that family was based in Scarsdale. Linda attended school and college in Scarsdale and basically spent her formative years there. And then Yoko Ono's family turn up there, and Yoko moves into Scarsdale for a period as well. So we have two future Beatles wives, both rocking up in this obscure town in Westchester County, New York, at the same time. And they both go on to wed two of the most prominent musicians in the world. Could that possibly have happened by random chance? Not a chance of it, I would say. So there's something about Scarsdale, and there's some reason why these two were there at the same time, and then went on to wed John and Paul the way they did. Yoko's influence would appear to have rubbed off on her sons. So this is Sean, John and Yoko's son, born in 1975, on John Lennon's own birthday, actually, the 9th of October. Here he is, quite recently, in a music video, rocking some very tired old symbolism that we've seen a million times in the videos from the likes of Lady Gaga and Katy Perry, with his Illuminati one-eye hat on, pushing the agenda. And here's Julian, John's other son, with Cynthia, and he's given it some familiar symbolism as well. We've got the one-eye thing going on, and he's forming this square symbol, which is indicative of squaring the circle within Freemasonry, the square on the Masonic checkerboard.
The runes underneath that as well.
Right, yeah, exactly. So, you know, they're all pushing agendas, and this raises the question, well, were both of John's sons got to and bought off by the industry in more recent years, or is it the case that John himself was so firmly embedded in the Illuminati control system of the music industry that his sons were just brought up through that whole thing, and in fact the whole family has been involved in it since day one? It's certainly looking like the latter, I would suggest. And here's a picture of Lennon and McCartney giving it a Masonic handshake from very early on in their career. So again, did they come out of this through family connections, or was this group bought and paid for very early on in their career by the forces that control the industry? Either way, no group would ever be allowed to achieve the level of prominence and influence that the Beatles did under their own steam. Doesn't happen. Never has, never could, no exceptions. McCartney from the from a later era, given it the what's supposed to be the wings sign, but somebody's identified this as being a representation of the square and compass coming out of Freemasonry. Linda doing the same thing. Of course, the cover story will be, oh, she's just saying wings. But everything comes with a cover story, right? And so we move on to one of the most controversial Beatles album sleeves of all time, known as the Butcher cover. This was for a compilation album that came out in June '66, so that's 666, known as Yesterday and Today. And on the cover of it, you've got the four Beatles in butcher's smocks, covered in raw meat, with decapitated toy dolls all over the place. What the hell is that all about? Very bizarre sleeve. It caused an uproar the minute it first came out in America. Fans weren't happy with it. They thought it was in poor taste. They found it disturbing. And so the record company Capitol worked to very quickly recall all the albums that had been distributed, and they replaced it with a new sleeve that was deemed less offensive. Here's another picture from that same photo shoot, which was directed by an Australian guy by the name of Robert Whittaker. And apparently he wanted to make an avant-garde statement in keeping with the art and the culture of that time. He wanted to push the envelope and be controversial and get the whole thing talked about. So here you've got McCartney looking like he's in a trance-type state, covered in bloody dismembered toy babies and stuff. And an original album of Yesterday and Today with that sleeve recently sold for 180 grand. So this is the replacement version of Yesterday and Today. When the original was recalled, Capitol produced this new image and they slapped a sticker over the top of it and then put the albums back out into the market. So if you've got an original album now with the butcher sleeve underneath and this one slapped on top, it is worth a hell of a lot of money, and they're extremely rare. But anyway, there seems to be some symbolism getting conveyed in this sleeve as well, particularly when it comes to the McCartney replacement theory, which we're going to cover in part 2. You'll note that Paul is sitting inside a steamer trunk of the type that was loaded onto ocean liners back in the days of seafaring. And researchers have pointed out that this could be a rendering of a coffin. And it's interesting that of the four Beatles, he's the one that appears inside the trunk. So there's been all kinds of examination of this sleeve as well. And this one particular blogger, who I've quoted here, has got an interesting take on it. He's saying the Yesterday and Today album cover is a representation of the story of Osiris, so we're back to Egyptian mythology again, whose body parts were put into a casket, a trunk, that washed up on the shore. The original Butcher cover represented Osiris having been chopped into 13 pieces by his brother Set. So this person's idea is that the meat represents, the chopping up of Osiris's body. And then to conclude, the two Pauls represent Osiris and Horus, the same guy in two bodies, a rubber soul occupying two bodies. In order for Beatles fans to connect the dots, there had to be clues about a death. Osiris died and was reborn as Horus. Yesterday and today was a phrase used in ancient Egypt describing Osiris, in the same way that some people say Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today and forever in this era. Interesting interpretation of that whole thing. We can't ignore the suspicious deaths of certain people closely affiliated with the Beatles when we're looking at unusual and unsettling aspects of that group, because there's been a few. So we've already covered Stuart Sutcliffe in the top left there. In the middle is the original Beatles manager, Brian Epstein, who is credited with having discovered them and put them on the map. He hawked them around the record companies, he got them their deal with EMI and Parlophone and basically created their career for them. And he was with them all the way through the Sgt. Pepper era until late August 1967, when he turns up dead at the age of 32, like you do, having evidently taken a bunch of sleeping pills and died by his own hand. So it's a suicide, according to the official version of things. There's a video you can get on YouTube of the reaction that the Beatles gave to the news of Brian Epstein having died. And they appeared genuinely shocked and shaken by the whole thing, particularly John Lennon. He's asked by the interviewer, what are you going to do now Brian's dead? And Lennon's just like, well, we don't know what we're going to do. He just seems completely disorientated, like none of them saw it coming. So, was this really suicide? There's lots more to Epstein's background and connections when you get into it. He was closely affiliated with the Cray twins in London, and there's all kinds of other unsavoury connections as well, which I don't really have time for now. Over on the top right there, we have Dr. Richard Asher, and we're going to encounter him a little bit more in part 2. He was the father of Jane Asher, who was the girlfriend of Paul McCartney for a long period in the 1960s. He was also a hypnotherapist, and a doctor who worked in the study of deep sleep and coma conditions and elements of mind control. And again, we're going to get into that further. But he died in 1969, and this is another suicide, so we're told. His body turned up in the basement of his house and his medical practice in Wimpole Street, London, and he'd apparently taken his own life. The only problem is he went missing about a week before that, and the family searched the house and couldn't find him anywhere. Then a week later, his body turns up in the basement, and we're told he committed suicide, even though he hadn't been there before. So it's all a bit strange, that one. Then down on the bottom left, we've got Mel Evans, who I made reference to earlier. He was a roadie and a close confidant of the Beatles. He was due to publish a book, which was said to be a tell-all memoir of life with the Beatles. And he was going to reveal lots of juicy gossip and secrets about the Beatles, so the story goes. He'd completed the manuscript, and it was all set to be delivered to the publisher in January of 1976. On the 4th of January, he got shot dead by cops in Los Angeles. And the story is that he started behaving a bit erratically. His girlfriend evidently called the cops and said she was concerned about him, and he's supposed to have been waving a rifle around, and the cops turned up, and there's said to have been this altercation, and Mel Evans got shot dead. It's very similar to the story of what happened with Bill Cooper, William Cooper, the researcher and author, when you get into that story. But anyway, subsequent to Mel Evans just happening to get shot dead by LA cops, his manuscript goes missing, and nobody knows where it went, so that book was never published after all. What would have been in it, we can only guess. John Lennon, in the middle there, shot, assassinated on the 8th of December 1980, we're told, by a deranged fan by the name of Mark Chapman, who showed all the signs of having been a mind-controlled Manchurian candidate assassin. But there's lots of questions about what really happened there as well, because present at the scene was a known CIA assassin by the name of Jose Perdomo, who was working as the doorman on the Dakota building of that night. And Perdomo had been used in various black ops assassinations on behalf of the CIA through the decades. He was involved in the Fidel Castro Bay of Pigs affair. And there he crops up as the doorman at the Dakota building, and then sort of glides back into the shadows after the event, and very few people seem to be asking questions about what he was doing there. Meanwhile, Mark Chapman gets thrown in jail with little chance of ever being released, and that's that whole story neatly tied up. Oh, Chapman shot him, and he was just a nutter, and that's all there is to know about it. Then we have George Harrison, who was attacked in his home, Friar Park near Henley-on-Thames, in late 1999, when an intruder, Michael Abram, got into the house. Somehow he bypassed one of the most complex state-of-the-art security systems anywhere in the country and got into Harrison's house, and Harrison got into a fight with him, and Abram stabbed him many, many times. And so the story goes, George's wife, Olivia, came to his rescue and started beating the attacker over the head, and she managed to prevent him from getting killed. Harrison was rushed to hospital, and he underwent all kinds of health problems from that point on. He had a punctured lung and contracted cancer, and he died about 2 years later at the end of 2001, so he really didn't live for much longer. The plan there would presumably have been for Harrison to have been taken out in the same way that Lennon was, but as I say, he didn't last much longer anyway. And he turned up dead in a house in Los Angeles, and if you go on Wikipedia it will say, oh, George Harrison died at the house of a friend. But further research has revealed that the house where George died was actually owned by Paul McCartney, which is not widely reported. So, whatever the case, something happened to the Beatles between their phase 1 period, when they first came out as these lovable mop-top guys in matching suits, singing nice love songs like She Loves You and From Me to You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, you know, these nice pleasant boys, to the latter Beatles period, from sort of 66 onwards, where they went psychedelic and they started embracing the counterculture of the times, and they got very experimental and avant-garde with their music. Would this really be the natural progression of a group going through a few years, left to their own devices, calling the shots themselves, rather than for stooges or puppets being directed in what to do and what to say? You know, at every stage of their career, they would dress the same, wear their hair the same, talk the same. They never struck me as four fiercely creative, independent individuals expressing themselves on their own terms. Looking back at it now, they just strike me as agents that are being used by other parties, other forces, to further certain agendas, and this was always the case. That pretty much wraps up what I've got on the Beatles as a group. In part 2, I'm going to be getting into the whole Paul McCartney conspiracy. So we're going to have a little break here. We have refreshments, I believe. I've got copies of my books at the back which cover a lot of this stuff. There's t-shirts there as well. Other than that, I'll see you in... How long do we have?
20 minutes?
20 minutes or so, thanks.
Yeah.